Welcome back, everybody. We'll get started now with Roundtable Session 2. The thematic for this session is Virtualizing Design Pedagogy and its implications. And we have speakers back in the AA with Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg. And with me here in Melbourne is Kate Finning. Kate is a studio leader here in the MArch CDE Studio 9 and is also working with Andrew Power. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate and let her do her presentation, about 15 minutes, and then we'll switch and share screen back to Europe with Lara and Fredrik. Okay, Kate.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I just thought today we'd share a little bit about the way that we work both together and in the studio. And it's our first studio teaching at MSD. So it's all a bit, it's happening as we speak. And essentially working, I'm face-to-face and Andrew is remote. And it's something that we have been used to over 2020 because we've been working on competitions overseas with architects and landscape architects in collaboration. So it's very easy to imagine how that would be directly applied to our teaching. Where just as a background, the brief is to design a house, a double house, let's say, in suburbia, and the students it's supposed to be both a typical family house and be able to operate as two autonomous dwellings at the same time. Yeah, I was just going to talk about how we structure our teaching and as well our work together. And I'll go into some logistics, of course, but in terms of like the way that we structure our studio, it's also responded a little to the way that we've found students work today and also the skills that they have, even though we're still quite young. I graduated from AA in 2015. We've noticed that there's already a shift in the skills that students have and what they are confident with, say, compared to us. So in most aspects of our teaching and the way we work, we've developed this kind of triple approach that's kind of developed spontaneously, where each project, the design of a building is broken into the plan, volume, and the building's expression. And we're very output focused. So we see the drawing of the plan, the model of the volume, and the image of the building's expression as really projects in their own rights. But perhaps what's more interesting and something that's kind of developed unbeknownst to us is that we have a kind of way of reasoning or a critique, tools for critique for each of these elements, being reason from first principles with the plan, reason by analogy with the building's volume, and feeling essentially for the building's expression. So I guess reason from first principles was recently popularized by Elon Musk. And it's really just the idea that you break down super complicated phenomena into basic building blocks, which you can then build up again. And I think it's really important for the domestic plan to do this because there's so much cultural baggage and like there's a lot of information deep inside our psyches when it comes to the plan of a house. So for example, the double basin in the ensuite, the corridor to singular cul-de-sac rooms, if you like. Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects that are essentially invisible to the project of design, but I think reason from first principles can really help us break down the task of the plan. So we begin, in order to do this, we kind of equip students with the history of architecture told not through style, but the history of the floor plan. You know, why did furniture begin to be drawn in plans? When did the bedroom replace the parlor at the front of the house? And what do the doors in rooms, how does that indicate their use? Because we really understand for ourselves that we've had to learn architecture from our ABCs. There was really no a priori knowledge that we had to kind of educate ourselves. And this also serves the purpose of building a shared language within the studio. So all students are using the same terminology, not just linguistically, but of course, architecturally. And so from this, with what we've discussed in seminars, we have a selection of 16 case studies of exemplary, we think, apartment plans, which they then, if the seminars are more of a social cultural reading of the plan, a comparative analysis done, which is a pure formal reading outside of these contexts. And then in a kind of last effort to extract a principle from the plan, we both do this in our own work, but also the students extract a motif, which is very different to a diagram in that it's not trying to explain the whole building in a single idea, or at least, or even a process of the plan. It's really trying to zone in on a single moment or move in the architecture that we can kind of extract from the reference or case study. So example that you can insert a room into a larger room, thus creating a multiple spaces within the one larger space. And at the same time, we've also experimented with suggesting how students might talk about architecture. We've found overconfidence perhaps on rhetorics, and it's a discussion of architecture that very rarely includes material outcomes or architectural form. So we've been experimenting and openly with them, I guess, to say, like, you could say, this is the motif that I have and this is how it's doing it in my plan. But essentially, rhetorics is something I'll come back to later. And students we've found are very gifted in this aspect, but often not so much in the skills required to turn that into an output or building. So we really focus on, yeah, I'll come back to rhetorics. And the markup is something we've been using, which helps with working remotely, but also there's a something that you can see in people's projects when you sit alone with a drawing for 10 minutes in silence that you would never get through the format of a discussion. So once the project develops up into a point, we start to query their moves in markups. So this is a grid that's something Andrew and I came up with as a way to help us order not only the architects that we admire, but also maybe to navigate our own work. And essentially it's that you can plot any architect on this Cartesian grid as being either geared towards rhetoric or the art of building. On one plane, and then on the other, either obsessive in the pursuit of a singular kind of answer to something, or schizophrenic in the sense that you can jump around from style to style or find a new career trajectory every decade, if you like. And so we showed this to students at the beginning, just to say that for the purposes of our studio, we're very much geared towards the building aspect of architecture. And that rhetoric wouldn't be the focus, and that language could not be used, or at least wouldn't be accepted as a means of justifying the project. Anyway, so once we've built the plan back up from first principles, we kind of allow ourselves the shortcut of reasoning by analogy. And it's definitely a shortcut, and it's a crutch to rely on references. And we'd say it's a big problem if this is your general approach to teaching, but in the sense of a building's volume, I think analogy does have its role, if you like. And so just as an example in our own work, I think it also helps to use historic references, because then you're not at risk of using them stylistically. You can really see them for the volume that they are. So this is an example just of a volume analogy, I guess, that we used for a competition that was also on a lakefront. And we liked how it dealt with the crisis of the object, in that it has to both face the approach by land, but also had to have a facingness to the sea. And so it has to deal with this kind of double frontedness that an object building, say like the Villa Rotunda, never could. And so when we use models both with the students and ourselves to explore volume, but of course when you're working remotely, the spatial feeling of a model is difficult to communicate. So Andrew has come up with a rotating cake stand, which we think might be some part of the way that you can communicate spatial feeling to others. And so with students, when we're dealing with volume and reason by analogy, we use examples from classicism as a way to describe the way that volume has been dealt with in the past. And then we can discuss themes such as the charge void, or in this case, an agglomeration of forms which can break down a larger mass. And for this portion of the semester, we really kind of take our, we let them go, I guess, in a sense, because understanding that we have a common project in plan, we think that it's suitable for us to let go a bit the expression and volume project that they have, but we're kind of there to guide them along the way. And importantly, in developing models, it's not about, this is a student model, it's not about having 10 options for a single plan. It's really about identifying one approach and then testing permutations of that approach. So for example, in this, the height of the tower, rather than can it be a tower house? Can it be a courtyard house? Can it be an L-shaped house? So lastly, we move on to the building's expression, which is really the best that we've been able to describe about the feeling of the architecture. And just as an example, you can use examples of, this is Robert Grosvenor's work, who's a sculptor, who really, we think the work has a feeling of coherence and centeredness. It's not symmetrical, but each part belongs to the whole. It's also very light, and its light frame structure frames a kind of heavy plinth, which is also sitting on a tarp. Which has its own separation from the ground. And again, this is another work by the same artist, where the vertical elements are much more emphasized, have a greater hierarchy than the horizontal elements. And it really kind of defies what we were taught, or at least observe in the principles of trabeation, for example, like the horizontal element is almost non-existent. And so in our own work, we try to translate this feeling into our proposals. And this is a pizza kiosk in the center of a large car park, which you perhaps can see has similar expression to those, with the strong vertical elements and very slight horizontal and light expression. And for our students, the project's expression is completely within their own interests, and we don't have any interest in controlling any kind of house style or how a building is expressed. And although, you know, and once they've found that expression for themselves, we can then teach or share with them how to use architectural elements to benefit that or contradict that. And while this isn't something, you know, an expression we would necessarily use for our own work, we think it's important to support it on the basis that it has a distinct feeling. And at least, you know, if we understand the principle of arts and crafts in this case, we can help guide their project. And also, we've been using the markup in order to guide them through not only architectural expression, but also the composition of the image in terms of proportion and things we've learnt from landscape painting or representational art. So I also just wanted to very briefly mention some logistics that have helped with having one teacher in person and one teacher over in interstate. We use a shared Google Drive, and each student uploads their project at the beginning of every class. It serves the purpose of them having to deliver something every class, and also Andrew being able to access it when he's not here. Also, most important factor to class discussions is the microphone that you see on this desk, which Donald kindly facilitated for us. And it really, that kind of meant that Andrew was really in the room. There's no issue with hearing or him being engaged in discussions. And lastly, we're really interested in questioning the format of the crit. And something that a lot of our students have an art background, I think 3 or 4 of them. And at the pub, they mentioned that the way that crits are run in art school is actually the opposite to the way it's run in architecture school. So we've been experimenting for 2 classes now a student-run crit where the student presenting does not talk about their own work first, but instead the other students ask questions. And then it's only at the end that the student whose project it is talks about the work. And it serves the purpose of allowing us the time to do markups, but also that rhetorics, again, don't bolster the project, but that it can stand on its own right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Okay, we're going to now switch, and I can see Lara and Fredrik there. We're going to allow you to take over and share the screen and have your 15-minute presentation.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. And hi, Kate. I don't think we've met in person, but it's great to see you. Great to see you again as well, Donald.
All right. So we're gonna talk a little bit about this in response to the topic that was set for today. Just for those of us who might not know us, giving a little bit of background on what we do. We run our practice, which was funded in Bangkok, where we started first teaching at INDA, and currently we teach at the Architectural Association and at Daniels, University of Toronto. Important for us to mention this since, like our practice has, since its very beginning, been run in parallel with our teaching, very important for us. And just to give a bit of overview, we practice in let's say, a myriad of different ways, which we find are very connected, but might be harder for others just to understand that or to see those connections. We build buildings. We have also worked on a bunch of interiors that where we have had the luck also to develop specific furniture collections for them. So from furniture to houses to large proposals for even cities or large public buildings, to also designing virtual spaces, social spaces. We will be talking about this more in detail today, as well as collaborations and commissions for cultural institutions that are often in the form of, sorry, this slide is failing. Oh, some weird transition, sorry about that. In the form of exhibitions in galleries and museums, as we're seeing here, that usually manifest or come together with what we are calling a spatial essay, which is basically a virtual reality film that takes you through an idea. And these are all developed specifically for a particular place. This is something we wanted to talk about that is very important for us and for the work and research we do with the students, that is location sensitive virtual reality.
So this is the first example where we used this in our own work, in our exhibition, The Glass Chain at Storverkstad in London, which, as you can see here, features a large glass sculpture and a series of murals and a spatial essay. And these spatial essays is something that we also work together with our students with, and why we wanted to introduce first how we work with them in our own practice. And we've to date created about 5 or 6 of these spatial essays that are specifically created to be experienced being inside of the media, meaning wearing a headset in this case, with the beginning here of The Glass Chain 2017, and the most recent one, Freestyle, at the RIBA in London in 2020. And we'll just take you through a few of these examples and how they relate to ideas of pedagogy and teaching and learning generally. So this is a photograph from the Royal Palace of Milan, where we in 2019 put together an exhibition which featured this large-scale physical installation, as well as a spatial essay seen through 2 different virtual reality headsets for different languages, Italian and English. And we won't go into detail of what the exhibition was about, but I'm sure you can see here in this printed fabrics that there are still reflections of the room together with other characters and other elements that related to what the tapestries in this specific room were about. But really, to the key here and what we want to relate and what we think is really interesting in the ideas of teaching and learning using new media in architecture is here basically Lara interacting with the installation and seeing film on the other side, where we see this thing, this character that we call virtual guides or virtual hosts, which is basically, in this case, one-to-one human-like anthropomorphic figures that speak directly to you and that you can move closer to and you can move from. And then, as we can see here, the room, we won't go into detail what exactly is happening, but the room slowly gets activated, things can be revealed, and things can be explained in incredible detail, because the entire environment can literally change as the story unfolds. And here's an example when this virtual host is describing this 17th century tapestry that the entire film is actually about. And again, in relationship to kind of teaching and learning, we found this incredibly powerful. And this also relates to very closely to our most recent exhibition, Freestyle Architectural Adventures in Mass Media at the RIBA, where we can see here, this is still from the immersive spatial essay seen through a headset, where we can see this little figure here being the virtual host in this case, starting the film by guiding you through what this specific exhibition was really about, which is Sebastiano Serlio's first book, actually volume 4 on style. And the exhibition is then tracing 500 years of mass media and its relationship to style and architecture, specifically focusing on England.
Yes, so through the essay, which basically takes place on this twin version of the RIBA gallery and this twin version of also that sort of mashup model that we created representing styles across time, we're taken through different, let's say, learning material and devices at different scales. Sometimes the model itself becomes a bookshelf where actually we flick through books, or where those panels from the books come out and in relationship with the model itself. Other times full spaces open up, relating what was in this case important, which was media hardware, to its impact on environments. So it becomes also this like the pedagogical object within the space that it is talking about. And here are some more examples of those environments, also talking about, in this case, current forms of media and interfaces, and speculating on these ideas of how this might jump out of the screen. And that's a notion that by the middle of the 21st century, all media will be accessed, and in its form itself will be spatial. What we thought was interesting to talk about, perhaps within the topic of today, is how we think architectural spaces can turn into spaces of information, or spaces of direct learning, direct access to data, both through the composition of the space itself and through augmented technologies. So this exhibition brought together 2 years of research that was really about looking at understanding patterns within historical data contained within the RIBA archive, which was represented in an immersive essay, a spatial essay in 4 acts, but then was also represented, or like what's also encoded in the design of the room itself through different elements. The whole room was organized as a timeline that was broken down in different chapters according to the different styles that we were going through, and was also like sprinkled through with more figurative representations of the different types of media hardware.
And we wanted then also to, now the second half here, focus more on how we have been engaging with these sorts of technologies and the ideas of virtuality directly with students, and going back to the beginning, which is not that long ago, when we started working with this together with students. And this took place in early 2015 at a workshop in Bangkok at INDA, where we used to teach, where we ran a workshop together with Nandi Nobel and your very own Mond Qu, who at that time, already in these very early days of virtual reality, was already very accomplished in sort of exploring these ideas. So together we work with students to kind of at the very beginning, instead of thinking about what is really inside of these virtual spaces, how is the body really interacting with the spatial media? So we built all these together with the students strange contraptions and built sort of games and things where we were testing interactions and different kind of moments of what if one person has one kind of way of seeing something, whereas another can see something else, and how the communication between them works. And this is usually how we do these things. So this is from our studio in Bangkok, where we work very, very much hands-on together with students, developing the ideas for these workshops. Of course, today is quite different, and we'll get to that in a second. We've also done a lot of workshops together with students around the world. This is at Konstfack in Stockholm, where we were exploring notions of passing through thresholds that might be half physical and half virtual. So you can see here this person wearing a headset is walking around the spaces that the people that are not in that media sees as just dotted lines on the ground. We're also, here we can see examples of this, where here the students were creating models of two kind of, for them, interesting physical architecture, and then combining them in virtual space and using very, very mundane basic things to create new sorts of thresholds, where you, if you peek your head through, in this case, the opening, that staircase, you would be looking in from one completely different space to another. And here we can also see an example of something, other notions that we explored with students, which is more directly about how the physical body is literally interacting with different textures. And this is something that we've actually explored in Melbourne together with groups of students at the AA Visiting School in 2018, where students built specific kind of connections between the space of the body and the space of that virtual media. And different groups working on different kind of touch moments. So this group was working specifically on the notion of walking across surfaces. Another group was working specifically on the grasping of architecture, using hand tracking technology and building, again, a virtual version and a physical version that coexisted. Of course, many of these kind of workshops, they're very sort of speculative and open, and they don't really address specific architectural issues, which is something we'll get to now.
Yes, so moving from what Fredrik was talking about, of these like very particular or very niche experiments for a speculative future when we might inhabit mixed reality environments, to what's happening very much today in relationship to these new forms of accessing virtual space or digital space that is three-dimensional. Here are some short exercises on considering what happens to an average apartment of someone that uses this type of technologies, and how that gets constantly rearranged, or how that overlaps and gets rearranged in relationship to the space that is being overlapped with, which is something that is very much a reality for anyone that works with this, and even something that the hardware providers are very directly advising on, and telling you basically how to rearrange your domestic space, in this case usually your living room, in order to be able to bring in these other realms. So prompted by these ideas, and this we think illustrates it quite hilariously, the dream house of someone that has a VR headset from the Facebook group Virtual Reality, here showing how it would be basically an empty space where all the functions can be pushed to the side. And through some research that we've been doing, we provided a speculative film that is actually available to also watch online, just on a screen, where we were exploring the notion of the bedroom and the fact that we cannot ignore the physical spaces in which we are anymore, because the digital space is not contained on a screen, but it's actually deployed on top. So if we are to meet in some kind of three-dimensional medium, we will end up with all sorts of overlaps that will push us to think about how these vent rooms, or like these overlapped rooms, come together, and where are the moments of coherence, where are possibly the moments of like perceived incoherence, or very much clash of these two environments.
But of course, in the kind of notion of Marshall McLuhan, I guess, the media itself and its hardware and how you interact with it in the physical world is constantly related to how you interact with it, what the actual content is. And we'd also do a lot of research and work with students using social virtual worlds where you actually transfer your body into an avatar. This, in the year of the pandemic, is the only unit trip, studio trip we took with our students. This is all of our students at the AA. I am this little kitten here hiding behind the balustrades. This is Joe Hunting, the incredible documentary filmmaker. And this is something that we find incredibly interesting. We do a lot of research around, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this growing field of different sorts of platforms and spaces to use. We tend to try and use as much as we can Mozilla Hubs because it's specifically driven by a non-profit which has a strong ideology for a healthy internet, unlike many other platforms that are very much revenue driven. This was also a very important part of our exhibition Freestyle, where you can see these video screens here where we showed work that was created by a group of high school students at a technical high school in the outskirts of London, together with curator Shumi Bose, where we specifically made a point of only spending 2 hours teaching them how to use Mozilla Hubs with students that were not really familiar with 3D softwares before. And they all managed to create virtual environments that they could share and interact with.
Yes, and here are some of our own experiments, basically bringing the Freestyle exhibition online since it opened 2 weeks before the pandemic, and our realization that that perhaps we should also be working with these spaces that are accessing remotely. And it's something that we have been thinking through more critically during the past year. As we were saying before, we were always creating installations that were location specific, as we think that this, considering the overlap, is very important. And now we're trying to think about what is this in-between stage in which we are, where we're accessing these three-dimensional spaces through the screen, navigating with our keyboard with these strange avatars. And yeah, one of the key things that we're working with, or that we think critically about, is what in this in-between stage spatial audio is doing for us in terms of creating perhaps more fluent or more natural forms of coming together via screens.
And just give you a very quick overview of what we're working on with our students at the AA at what we call the Civic program, which asks students to create civic architecture for the immersive internet, where students are working on things like issues such as what might happen to public space and a future augmented world. And students such as Tommy developing an idea of how a future of tourism can feature overlapped cities, Jana developing a kind of global learning interface, and Tyler here developing a kind of augmented overlaid over the House of Parliament in England, where community centres from across the UK can virtually join the lobby of the House of Parliament by Charles Barry and interacting directly in political debates virtually by bringing their avatars into the space. Or Amy developing a kind of sign language system. Here we can again see the House of Parliament during a debate. And we're also here just a few examples of projects that have been developed at the University of Toronto, with a project here visualizing the history of censorships of authors globally. Or Shaya has developed a visualization system for trust indexes between nations. Janice has developed an archive of memes. And finally, Melanie, who developed a kind of global visualization device for meteorological data across the world. And with that, and with 2 minutes running over, apologies for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you, Lara. Okay, let's jump into this. So again, the title for this roundtable discussion was Virtualizing Design Pedagogy and its Implications. And I remember in mid-January of 2020, we were having a faculty meeting talking about some new programs, some new ways of working. And there was a mention about, well, maybe we could do some things online. We could have some online classes. And most of us, and certainly I was absolutely adamant that, well, we could probably do that for some electives and history courses, but there'd be no way you could do that for a design studio. And just over 2 months later, on a Monday morning, we were all told, okay, by tomorrow afternoon, you need to leave the building and not come back. But you're going to have to figure out how to teach online fully, not partially, but fully. And so almost immediately, well, all of the studios, all of the design studios, in fact, all subjects at the University of Melbourne went online. And there were, of course, issues around asynchronous teaching or asynchronous delivery versus synchronous delivery, recording lectures and presentations and putting them up so people could access them later and so on and so forth. A year later, and we're now here in Melbourne in a somewhat privileged position of actually being back in the building. And more than half, about 2/3 of our design studios are teaching face-to-face, but we also have about 1/3 that are still teaching online primarily. And we have a few that are teaching with a kind of blended synchronous learning system as well. So I guess my question is really, because in a certain way, and I'm going to throw this first to Lara and Fredrik, you were teaching virtualization. So how do you virtualize virtual teaching?
I mean, I guess the only thing that really changed for us is that we were really working with access to particular hardware in the building and also access to space. I think the big difference for us was that before we had the possibility of doing these experiments in AA workshops and AA rooms that we were given access to, where we were really looking at the maybe like 10, 20 years in the future when there would be much more of a spatial overlap of these different realms. And the way it hit us this year is like, wow, okay, it's this like in-between phase in which we are is now here for everybody. So how do you start thinking about coming together and gathering remotely in the best possible way? And what is the role of an architect in thinking about this when we are still at this sort of, we call it fax machine stage, where we are all stepping into meetings, but they are all sort of 2D, we're slapping videos together. We're not really in rooms, even though we call them rooms, not these Zoom rooms and stuff. It's like, it's like a wall, it's like a grid of things. So that's why we started thinking more critically about this like in-between moment when you have some people accessing to the screen, some people maybe coming in through headsets. And what is this like 2.5D experience, right? So in terms of how we teach, I think we expanded quite a lot on tools that allow the students and us, all of us together, to really get the sense of a group. And we realized that we needed to embrace all forms of coming together. Like it's not just about a group video call, that it ends up being a series of speeches because each person has to talk one at a time, but also embracing like, yeah, maybe we visit virtual worlds that we make sure all the students can come together, but as well like simple things like chat, like shared boards, all forms of like being able to brainstorm and to share work. As a group, making sure that there is still space for like the little side discussion. So we have tried all sorts of formats of like, okay, what if we have like several rooms and you can jump into a side room? Or what if we are actually in virtual spaces that are enabled with spatial audio, and this allows us to step aside and discuss something else while still we are all together in the same space. So there's been a change in the methods, which actually we have discovered a lot of things that we want to continue using. And we think it might be difficult to use them when we are all together in the same room. It's kind of hilarious. Now we're like, oh, maybe we sometimes need to be apart in order to really use these tools properly. And there has been also a change in the focus of the topic, let's say, trying to resolve more immediate issues of gathering remotely as an architectural design topic, as opposed to the pure focus that we had on the sort of near 10, 20-year future before.
I'm just wondering, I mean, in one sense, when I look at a lot of your projects, the virtual reality environment that you produce is to a certain degree a kind of out-of-body experience, a kind of a certain kind of phantasm or phantasmagoria even, you might say. But interestingly now, because we are having to, do even this session, we kind of have to focus in front of a camera and in front of a microphone. So it's actually quite fixing, if not fixating. So it kind of, it both allows the fact that you're in Europe, we're here in in Australia, and yet we're communicating as if we were in the same room, but obviously we're not, but we're also fixated by the kind of presentational aspect of it. How has that interrupted, you might say, your previous methods of teaching, and particularly the kind of spatial experience? Because it seems your projects are very much about a kind of spatial experientiality to the work.
Yeah, I think one thing, obviously, which is, I think, important to note is that not just the way we have been literally forced this year to interact with certain virtual tools to be able to continue working together, but also more generally. I mean, we are in the spirit of wanting to work together and be collaborative. Not just us, but generally, humans are just incredibly good at compensating for the lack of certain communication media, even spoken language. Like, it's not ideal for exchanging anything really. And architects are great at using different kinds of tools. So I think in our case, we try and be as plural as possible with the way that we can exchange with one another, and especially really focusing on different new forms of being together. Because that, I think, is obviously the kind of, I think generally, I don't really know, but I would generalize that this has probably been, for some tutors, probably been easier than it has been on students. And often you hear the perspective of the tutor. And in our case, we haven't met a single student in over a year. And we finished with our students in Toronto. We never got to meet them. And from our perspective, actually, there are certain things that are incredibly just efficient with teaching like this. But also the projects change completely, both with what students are interested in thinking about, kind of ideas they're interested in, but also the inability to work in the way that we were showing here with actually like being inside a space, using your body to interact with these virtual media. Yeah.
I mean, it's for Kate, for the studio you're teaching here. You're here in Melbourne. Your students are here in Melbourne. You're in the same room together. Primarily, Andrew is in Sydney. I mean, he did come down for the mid-semester reviews, but is there a not just a physical separation, but is there a kind of pedagogical, almost authoritarian separation that you're here physically with the students, you can go look over their shoulder, whereas Andrew has to sort of present in a sort of different way. How is that differentiation happening?
Yeah, I guess I do more of the pastoral work as well because I'm more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
The non-academic work, I guess. Yeah, and I think they see him as possibly more of a consultant, even though he's present for every single class for the same number of hours as I am. Mm-hmm. And we would have equal spoken time, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Does it change in terms of, I mean, you were saying that you're doing a lot of markup on drawings and students putting their files on so he has access. Is that markedly different from the way you work and operate within the room versus the way he has to operate from a distance?
Yes and no. That probably informed how I operate in the room.
Right.
Because now we're both doing it at the same time while the students run the crits for themselves. Yeah, it's interesting, like when we were talking about technology, Andrew and I, in terms of the tools that we've been using. And I think that Cal Newport, like self-help guy, says that often when we adopt a new technology, even if it's like Pinterest, we only need one positive aspect in order to wholly accept it. We never kind of sit down and do the pros and cons. Yeah, so for us, I think we're more in the camp of like the pros and cons, like the markup, for example. We had the choice of whether we start using like a digital markup software. But yeah, sitting down doing the pros and cons, we just thought a printer and a scanner does the same thing. But it depends. But then the Google Drive is super effective. But yeah, it's definitely going to inform our future totally face-to-face studios. And it's also interesting that now we have access to teaching at like, you know, if you're in a city, Melbourne, we have access to teaching at like 3, 4 maybe institutions. But now with Andrew in Sydney, we have access to teaching at like 8 institutions. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, because this is something that is reoccurring in our discussions, is you know, there's a very strong push, and you know, we certainly have it here because we are back in the building, to quote unquote get back to normal, to the way it used to be. But I wanted to ask each of you, both Lara and Fredrik, but also Kate here, what have you had to do in the last year that you don't want to lose? A way of working, or an aspect, or a technology, or a mode of operation that you don't want to lose?
Well, there are, I think for us, there are many. We embraced some of the tools that I don't know, I'm sure, Kate, you explore these kind of tools, like kind of big boards that you can work on collaboratively. I think for us, the immediacy of the exchange of ideas, basically we're using the internet is plugged into every second of our teaching at the moment. Just with references, every single thing that's spoken is visualized instantly in a reference, in a link, in a text, in a video, and it stays and it gets recorded. And that's something that literally we cannot go back. Our teaching has sped up to a level where we're literally running on like 500% capacity compared to what it's like to be face-to-face. So that's definitely something. Then I think another really important point for us is the kind of the breaking of the tyranny of the metropolis, like the fact that you have to be physically in a place to have this really meaningful exchange in a really meaningful kind of important institution, whatever, if it's the AA or something else. And I think that we ideally do not stop now. That like we've made this, like what you were saying, Kate, like the opportunity to interact globally is something is incredibly positive. That I think if we go back, it would be a disaster. I think if we force people to again move back to expensive metropolis where you maybe many people cannot go there, you know? Yeah,
I mean, from personally, I'm from a small region in the north of Spain where I had access to no architecture school. Had to move to Madrid. Then from Madrid, I was encouraged to move to London to study the Architectural Association, and all those steps were also huge decisions in where do I make my life. And possibly what that would mean is that like maybe never being able to come back. Now I'm so happy that there is a window that like maybe I can come back to this place that I really love, but where I would have closed doors to all of these things that are happening. And I think like many people that does not happen to be born in like New York or London, or does not happen to have access to even move there or to even see what is going on in there. So I think it is really important what these might do for access to education, or to everything, access to everything, all kind of activity and ideas and ways of thinking that are usually often taking place in places that have more funding, that are usually metropolitan centers. So I think this is very important. And I think Kate mentioned something very interesting prompted by your question, Don, about how it feels with your teaching partner who is joining remotely, and it feels like you do more of the pastoral work, or students feel like you are more immediately accessible. And I think this is what will happen naturally because now we are presented in this abstract way through a flat screen, and that feels like you're not as reachable. And I think all of that is by design in terms of like, how do we appear? How do we make ourselves available? and all these things that now are in the hands of people who is designing online platforms should be things that architects are considering and thinking about, no? And like, how do we create spaces? It's not only the spaces now, but like, how do we start to embrace new forms of interactions and create spaces around these new forms of interactions that we are building, so that we can truly come together. And for that to happen, like the research we do with our students is to really think about like, okay, how do you feel? Try to analyze like what are the different forms in which we feel that someone is present in the room. What are the signals that we currently have that express that somebody is accessible? How do we feel in which kind of virtual environments do we feel like we are part of the group and we can come up and talk to people or participate and ask a question? And in which formats we don't, no? Even like considering very critically formats like this, where you don't raise your hand or like you don't even nod because you don't even have your camera on, right? Like what kind of presence is that? And if we start thinking critically of the current tools, we can start having a say on what the new forms of presence, new tools will be. And we can start to think about what are the sort of gathering spaces, what is the architecture that we build around that.
Okay, do you have, I mean, is there any aspect that's come up that you feel like you don't want to lose that in a sense?
Yeah, I think just that Andrew and I don't need to be in the same city. Like it's really almost a non-issue. And just on that point, like for being more accessible for students, it's also like part of the reason Andrew moved was COVID and job, issues. And so he's kind of like, his living expenses now, he lives in northern New South Wales, like 1/5. So it applies to teachers as well as students. But yeah, I think we'll just keep working both in our own projects and teaching online. It works quite well.
And it's still, I mean, it's like this event. I mean, one of the, I mean, it's interesting that, the AA has always had a culture of, at least when I was there, we hardly paid anybody to give a lecture, but you would take them out to dinner. But, everybody passed through London on the way to someplace else, if not to London itself. So the AA, was a plethora of lectures and reviews and such. We have a different problem here. It's very hard to get people to fly all the way to Australia. Much less, and if they do, then they need to stay for more than 24 hours to make it worthwhile. But one of the advantages of being online is that we have now had completely international juries and reviews and inputs and crits and presentations and lectures, which we could never, not only not afford, but it would just be impossible to get people to commit the time to come for a small intervention. So it also changes that notion of kind of linkage and such. And maybe that's more an issue for us here in Melbourne than it is for someone that's in London or Paris or New York or something like this.
Yes, and then, and also, I mean, you say like, yeah, maybe London is a place where more people passes by, but not everyone passes by London, right? So it is also a problem, this like reliance on like whoever has the privilege of being able to come to London and therefore gets to give a lecture at the AA. I think the kind of lectures that we were having before March 2020 at the Architectural Association were not comparable to the lectures that we have been able to have in the past year. That when I thought that they have brought in some incredible people that I'm pretty sure we would have otherwise never had the chance, basically because of that perhaps quite problematic thing of how little it's being paid for a lecture. So, or like bringing people over and so on. So I think that the plurality of views or like the amount of people you get to hear from is really widening, and that's something I think I can speak for both of us, would definitely not want to lose. But the centrism and the narrowness of the metropolis has finally been opened up, and hopefully we can keep that.
Okay, we're going to have to call a close to it there for the end of roundtable number 2, session number 2. And we're going to take another 5-minute short break and then proceed on to session 3 with Mond Qu, Justina, and Chris. Thank you all. We'll see you in 5 minutes. And don't forget about the chat, the spatial chat that's still operating in the intro period. Great to see you. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, all.